So this is Professor Stefan Manz. He's a professor of global history at Aston University in Birmingham, the United Kingdom. He's a global historian with a particular interest in the First World War, Germany's global entanglements, and public history. His monographs include Enemies in the Empire, Civilian Internment in the British Empire during the First World War, which appeared through Oxford University Press in 2019, and Constructing a German Diaspora, the Greater German Empire, 1871 to 1914, which was selected as a Choice Outstanding Academic title in 2014. The title of his keynote presentation for our symposium today is In the Fold of a Greater German Empire, German Speakers from Russia, and Diasporic Connectedness before 1914. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stefan Manz.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction and the invitation. Those Germans who lived in the Volga region and had access to the Deutsche Volkszeitung in the years before 1914 were firmly integrated into global flows of information. These are just three snippets from the Deutsche Volkszeitung in the years before 1914. The Volga Germans, published in Saratov, the Volga Germans would learn about local news, about farming news, about political issues, local political issues, about social issues, but they would also learn about news that went beyond the immediate community. For example, they would learn about other Russian-German communities in Russia, die Deutschen in Volhynia. They would also learn about international news. For example, they would learn about some British-German tensions in the wake of the Daily Telegraph affair. Or they would learn about a pending or the danger of an uprising in Cameroon, in German Cameroon. And they would learn about America as well. So they would get news from America. For example, das höchste Haus der Welt, the highest building in the world, which had just been built in New York. Or they would learn about the richest German American, Klaus Spreckels, the famous Sugar King. There was also a section, Brief aus Amerika, which would regularly publish letters from Russian Germans who had migrated to America and would write back to the Deutsche Volkszeitung, always stressing the spiritual bond which would still be kept alive despite living thousands of miles apart. Okay. Now, in 1909, the Deutsche Volkszeitung republished an article which had previously been published in the Berliner Volksanzeiger. And in this, they stressed that at the moment there would be, so at the moment 1909, there would be 92 million German speakers across the world. And this was particular success for a proof of Germans sticking together abroad. And this was integrated into global power political discourses. The author of this article then stressed that England had attained a kind of, was in an unattainable position due to its colonial empire. But this was clear proof, so this is all in inverted commas, that Germany had really caught up and especially overtaken France in terms of its kind of global significance. So at face value, these sources from the Saratov press seem to validate those power political aspirations that were projected in the German-speaking diaspora in the years before 1914. There are various speeches by Wilhelm II, for example, where he keeps stressing how important the diaspora was for him. in terms of connecting not just German speakers abroad, but weaving those discourses into colonial discourses. So this is what I'd like to then talk about in my presentation. First, I will talk about metropolitan diaspora constructions. So to what extent in which ways did those ideas about a greater German empire that was projected in the diaspora take place within Germany itself? And the second part of my paper, I will go into the reception of these ideas in diasporic settings. So in a way, this links to the sources which I showed at the beginning, what was actually published and what kind of discourse was led in the actual diaspora. So in doing so, I'm trying to connect two fields of study. The one is global history, and the other one is Russian-German studies. We've just had an excellent edited volume by Anna Flach, and it's a pleasure to have Eric Schmalz here as well, who's contributed to that volume, will speak to us as well, which really makes that case to connect those fields of study. James Castile, in his contribution to that volume, is deploring that global historians haven't really taken account of Russian-German migrations, despite the analytical potential of that globally dispersed group. So there's lots of potential for global historians. On the other hand, there's lots of potential for scholars of German-Russian movements, Russian-German movements, to pick up on the methodologies developed by global historians. So in a way, that what I'm trying to test with you, whether that actually works, and also to what extent those ideas actually fell on fertile ground abroad. I'm on safer ground now because this is where page 3 starts, and I'll read off now, but try to, well, it works quite well actually, free speaking, but anyway, I'll now talk about those metropolitan diaspora constructions. So from the late 18th century, geographers, philologists, and historians started to become interested in German-speaking communities abroad. August Ludwig Schlözer, for example, wrote about those in Pennsylvania. Quote, "They are not Germans anymore." I left the German text here on the slide, and I'm reading the translation. "They are not Germans anymore. They're separated from us by their free will and are British subjects. Although they are body members of Jesus, they are not members of the German state body," unquote. So religious parameters prevailed over national ones. The sending region did not have any obligations to support those who had left it. This notion started to change in the post-Napoleonic era on the back of politicized definitions of Volk. In the absence of a German nation state, the idea of Germany as a Kulturnation was particularly attractive. This defined itself through a common culture and language rather than clearly demarcated territoriality. This deterritorialization of nationality then opened the gates to view emigrants as integral parts of the nation. In 1846, during the Vormärz period, Jakob Grimm stressed that, quote, "A folk is the essence of people who speak the same language," unquote. Georg Heinrich Perz of the Monumenta Germaniae Historica found that, quote, "We and the German folk outside the borders of the German states constitute a single entity, ein Ganzes." Perz found it desirable to establish contact with Germans abroad, quote, "in order to gain some influence on their literature for the preservation of the German language, their German spirit, Geist, and the memory of the fatherland," unquote. This reconceptualization went hand in hand with a terminological shift. In public discourse, the term Auswanderer, immigrants, was increasingly replaced with the neologism Auslandsdeutsche, suggesting persisting bonds with the homeland. Now, these discussions were not locked within academic circles, but were communicated to wider middle class and working class readers. Two important journals were Die Gartenlaube and Globus, both read by the liberal Bürgertum. They consistently referred to Auslandsdeutsche as outposts of Germandom abroad, leading to a mental remapping of the world in emigrationist terms. In 1862, for example, the Globus contended that in Australia, quote, the German stands up for which he is and recognizes only one legitimate flag, that of the black, red, gold, unquote. Now, for this process of mental remapping, I have suggested in my broader global study, which Mark mentioned at the beginning, the term diaspora construction. This is based on constructionist approaches towards nation building and transnationalizes these through the lens of emigration. Theorizations of diaspora argue for a relatively broad definition which goes beyond exilic victims of war and persecution. Robin Cohen, for example, presents a list of features of diasporas, which also includes, quote, an idealization of the putative ancestral home and a collective commitment to its maintenance, restoration, safety, and prosperity, even to its creation, unquote. Cohen looks more at diasporic communities rather than the metropole. I argue that these two areas have to be discussed in conjunction as one transnational communicative platform. In this, I follow Gabriel Schäfer and what he calls trans-state networks, namely that actors need to be in place at both ends, or even more ends, who create communication and transport networks to keep these real or imagined transnational bonds alive. Tolölian then identifies similarities between nation building and diaspora building. As he writes, populations are made into nations and dispersions into diasporas, unquote. Now, these broader theoretical observations are directly connected to the sources I quoted at the start of my paper. This process of diaspora construction was at work in Germany throughout the 19th century, and then also entered into a mutually reinforcing partnership with colonialism. Discourse leaders were hard at work constructing a close-knit, imagined community of fellow Germans, all belonging to the same folk, despite residence abroad. So a wide range of publications carried stories about specific German-speaking communities and individuals across the world. These stories followed a clear template. It's quite astounding, no matter what kind of articles you read about Auslandsdeutsch, it's always the same template and the same or a similar terminology. The communities were seen as thriving no matter what the geographical, natural, or political circumstances. They derived their strength from a common volkstum which endowed them with unique qualities such as industriousness, faithfulness, moral dexterity, and superior forms of conviviality. These qualities enabled them to overcome a hostile nature such as the Brazilian jungle, the Australian outback, or the Russian steppes. These environments were ultimately tamed and civilized. The same applied to hostile political environments such as Pan-Slavism in Eastern Europe or nativism in the United States. In these narratives, the presence of these German communities was ultimately beneficial and helped raise cultural, moral, and economic standards in their respective host environments. They were keen to preserve their Germanness, and the Heimat had a duty to support them in this task. And this is different to the 18th century source, which I mentioned at the beginning. So a clear kind of mental remapping had taken place. I will now take just one text as an example of this global blueprint. It is an article on Black Sea Germans, which was published in 1913 in Die Gartenlaube. The setting is depicted as empty land, which is colonized and civilized. Swabian settlers who were invited by Tsar Alexander from 1803 facilitated the colonization and Urbarmachung, the kind of making arable, of the Cherson district around Odessa. After difficult beginnings, the 23 rural colonien, which names such as Lustdorf and Großliebenthal, flourished in the 1840s and 1860s, or to the 1860s. Then came adversity when privileges were removed by the Russian state in the 1870s. Through their own skills, hard work, and solidarity, they managed to pull themselves out of the crisis. And at the time of writing in 1913, everything went upward and forward. The surrounding Russian farming villages are the local backdrop to present alterity and superiority. Quote, what sets the German settlements apart from the Russian farming villages in a particularly advantageous way are the better cultivated fields, the well-built villages, and clean dwellings. Russian civilization and productivity also benefited from the German minority in their midst. German artisans who had settled in Odessa, quote, were now a significant factor in the economic life of the city. The carriages and farming tools manufactured by the German artisans are now in use throughout southern Russia. Without the German wagon and plow, the Russian farmer would not be able to cope anymore, unquote. The main pillar of the community spirit was the common German roots, which were immune to assimilation. So far, Russian customs and ways have made only little inroads amongst the colonists. The latter stick tenaciously and firm to their traditional ways, unquote. Virtually no world region was exempt from this diasporic quasi-colonial gaze. As Jason Hansen has shown, cartographers were obsessed with remapping the world visually to construct the notion of a border-straddling and globally present German nation. And of course, there are a lot of these dots. It's the red dots, Verbreitung the dispersal of Germans across the earth. Down here in the southern Russian region, quite a few of those spots. One of those cartographers was Paul Langhans, who edited a huge amount of these kind of maps and texts about the German diaspora. He was firmly in the right-wing pan-German Alldeutsch spectrum, but these views went far beyond the radical right. As David Blackburn has remarked, quote, these views were not confined to a lunatic fringe. They had support among academics and school teachers and entered the language of political parties. So that's really the point I'd like to make with this paper, that a lot of this was in the middle of the kind of discourse that took place around the diaspora. So migrants were thus far more than border-crossing individuals seeking opportunities abroad. Rather, they were molded into agents of a national mission. So to the second part of my paper, I'd like to investigate what impact these shifting definitions had on ethnic self-understanding abroad. Did the ideas formulated in the metropole fall on fertile ground abroad? In my broader study, I show that many communities worldwide adopted the language and symbolism of a greater German empire. Kaiser's birthday, for example, on 27th of January, was celebrated with great pomp and circumstance, festivities, speeches, music, and church services. This occurred in urban contexts, but also in rural contexts. Less so in rural contexts. So a lot of this was kind of confined to urban migrant communities, but it trickled into rural contexts as well. These were performative acts which constructed a group identity both at local and global levels. The choreography and language of these events was strikingly similar, no matter whether you go to San Francisco or Glasgow or Yokohama or whatever place. So in my largest study, I looked at all those places and just found striking similarities between those. So for this kind of framing, Roger Brubaker has suggested the term groupism. He also warns that scholarship has to be careful not to fall into the same trap and refer to any kind of ethnic entities as groups. Critical discussion, such as at our symposium, is crucial. So how about Russia? Were German speakers untouched and isolated from these ideas about the greater German empire? Were those in southern Russia, as Dönninghaus puts it, in an information vacuum? Or as Castile argues for the period before 1914, were the ideas confined to the urban centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg? So in the Russian census of 1897, 1.8 million people gave German as their mother tongue. These were indeed too heterogeneous in order to talk about one single ethnic group. Broadly speaking, three different groups can be identified. First, Baltic Germans constituted a minority elite with a high proportion of academically trained aristocrats, landowners, merchants, and clergy. The second type were those who moved into the modernizing cities of central Russia, most importantly St. Petersburg and Moscow. The third type was those colonists who had moved into the southern Russian agrarian regions, called in from the 1760s to make the newly acquired territories arable. Despite high literacy levels, they produced relatively few academically trained elites. Non-agricultural occupations were more widespread amongst the Black Sea German than the Volga Germans. So the fact that the social makeup of these three groups was different does not mean that they were completely separate from each other. I argue that the different groups became increasingly connected before 1914, both with each other and with the metropole. The year 1871 was an important turning point as German unification created a metropolitan focal point. This was also the year when previously granted privileges within Russia started to erode. Another watershed year was 1905. Both the revolutionary upheavals and the modest liberalization afterwards led to an upsurge in ethnic activity, which also included expressions of diasporic belonging based on folkish ideas. This was more moderate amongst the southern Russian colonists and mostly based on cultural and educational projects. It was more pronounced amongst the Baltic and urban Germans, with some leading Baltic Germans subscribing to right-wing pan-German Alldeutsch ideas. For the Russian cities, I just referred to Viktor Dönninghaus's study of Germans in Moscow. Based on a wide range of sources, he comes to the conclusion that through the process of unification, some members of the German-speaking colonies started to see themselves as part of this newly emerging Reich in the West. What had previously been representatives from different German states and cities now formed into a community of people who were united by their common belonging to Germany, unquote. The other two groups are potentially more interesting in our context. First, for the Baltic Germans. Traditionally, their associational life had been of a cultural, scientific, and charitable nature without much reference to the German background. This started to change from the 1880s, not least through pressure from the host environment. Estonian and Latvian nationalism grew. Russification measures prohibited teaching in German. In 1905, violence from Estonian and Latvian laborers occurred against German landowners and enterprises. The subsequent modest liberalization then created space for more ethnic expression. Baltic Germans now instrumentalized the flexible concept of nationality as a defense mechanism to distance themselves from their equally nationalized host environment. In each of the three Baltic provinces, a centralized Deutsche Verein was established with a dense network of local branches. These Baltic initiatives were driving forces behind attempts to create not just an overarching Baltic German, but also a Russian German identity, which encompassed the various types of Germans in the Russian Empire. What emerged was a diasporic group, the Baltic Germans, which took on national leadership in unifying scattered and disparate groups whose smallest common denominator was a constructed common Volkstum. The branch in Riga can be taken as an example to demonstrate the scope, but also the limits of these endeavors. The ideological ground had been prepared from the 1890s when Ernst Serafim took over the editorship of the Dünar Zeitung. He was a graduate of Dorpat University in Estonia. This university was a hotbed of German nationalism and trained many of the teachers, pastors, and journalists who were crucial for disseminating folkish ideas across Russia. Serafim now remolded the Dünar Zeitung into a widely read nationalist newspaper with folkish ideas, which made a clear distinction between Germans and Latvians. Once the Deutsche Verein was founded in Riga just after 1905, membership numbers soared quickly, reaching 23,000 in 1909. And this is just another example, or linking back to the previous ones. This was also reported in Saratov. So the Germans in the Volga region would know about these developments. An example of a concrete result of the Verein's educational work was the opening of 4 German schools in 1906, reaching 10% of the city's German-speaking children. Ulrike von Hirschhausen, in her otherwise differentiated micro-study of multi-ethnic Riga, maintains that pan-German tendencies were only marginal phenomena. But she does not go into them in any detail. I argue that they have to be taken more seriously, both in Riga and elsewhere. In 1907, the Verein in Riga prepared the founding conference for a planned central association of all Germans in Russia. The meeting was attended by representatives from across the Baltics, from the Black Sea region, and from Moscow and St. Petersburg. The association aimed to establish teacher seminars for primary and middle schools, re-established Dorpat as a German language university. The university had lost this privilege in the 1880s. They aimed to circulate more information about each other and promote economic cooperation between the 3 different Russian-German groups in the Russian Empire. The association was ultimately prevented by the Russian authorities for being separatist, but demonstrates the change in tone and aspiration within German-speaking Russia. Okay, I will now move to the 3rd group, namely German speakers in southern Russia. We can first discuss those in the Black Sea region. Here we encounter differentiated notions of belonging and initiatives, again taking off after 1905. Germans had been moving into the region since the 1780s and continued to do so for the following decades. Although their memories of the Heimat were thus of a pre-national character, German nation-state formation reverberated in the region. During the Franco-German War in 1870-71, collections in the settlement colonies generated money for the dependents of German soldiers killed in action. So these were remittances or kind of donations sent to Germany. In the following decades, inspection reports by Russian civil servants found pictures of Bismarck and Wilhelm II on the walls of private homes and some magistrates' offices. The reports specifically mentioned the influence of incoming Reichsdeutsch laborers and artisans who had completed their military service in Germany. Many of the schools used German textbooks in geography and history lessons, which only devoted a few pages to Russia and contained sentences such as, quote, "In general, the Russians are found to be at a lower level of education. They're ignorant, superstitious, and prone to drunkenness." This is what school children would learn. At least 5,000 copies of the German newspaper Reichsbote circulated in the region. Transnational bonds with America were also upheld. For example, various subscriptions of German-American newspapers could be traced in the area, including the Dakota Freie Presse, the Iowa Herald, the Eureka Post, and the Lincoln Freie Presse. Associational life picked up after 1905 and reflects to what extent pro-German nationalism was, ironically, both a unifying and a highly divisive phenomenon in these diaspora communities. The Südrussische Deutsche Bildungsverein, here's again an excerpt from Deutsche Volkszeitung, was founded in Odessa during a meeting with 90 representatives from many kolonien in the Black Sea region. Their aim was to identify common interests and cooperation. Delegates, however, were not able to bridge the 3 main interest groups. First, a Protestant faction focusing on religious renewal, which warned against politicization of the association. Second, a more politicized faction led by Pastor Daniel Steinwand, who, and that is no coincidence, had studied at Dorpat University, and he stood in close contact with Baltic German nationalists. A third approach was represented by a group of Catholics and Mennonites. Their focus was on improving training and professional conditions in the colonists. The Catholic weekly newspaper, Clemens, launched a perceptive attack on the Steinwand Circle, arguing that their Protestant religion was only a pretext for disseminating national and folkish ideas, and that they positioned the German national aspect über alles. The Catholics prevailed, making the Bildungsverein a colonist educational association with a strong Catholic alignment. This was, however, then shut down by the Odessa local authorities in 1909 with the same reason: this is a separatist group, we don't need this in Russia. But then the Daniel Steinwand and nationalist circles still didn't give up. They founded a breakaway organization, and this is where that nationalism tended to be divisive. So it could be unifying, but also divisive. They founded a breakaway organization in the form of the Südrussischer Deutscher Verein, now without the Bildung. This was dominated by mostly university-educated, often Baltic Germans and graduates of Dorpat University. Two examples demonstrate their influential position in ethnic life, as well as the close connection between the Baltics and the Black Sea. Ernst Mittelsteiner was born in East Prussia, graduated from Dorpat, and was now headmaster of the St. Pauli Realschule in Odessa. Theodor Williger-Rode came from a pastor's household in Livonia, also studied at Dorpat, and was now pastor in the St. Pauli Church in Odessa. The Südrussischer Deutscher Verein established a number of elementary schools, libraries, and holiday camps. It developed education opportunities for women, including a trade school for girls and German language instruction for mothers. These cultural initiatives were always fed with political and folkish undertones. It aimed to fight against assimilation towards Russentum, Russiandom, and I'm quoting, and against Entdeutschung, so a kind of de-Germanization and fragmentation of the German settlement colonies. The imagery and self-referential metaphors were strikingly similar around the world. I'm just quoting one example, and that's the motive of German immigrants as Kulturdünger or Völkerdünger, so cultural fertilizer of other people, who ostensibly raised the levels of their host societies, but were at the same time underappreciated by them. And Sebastian Conrad, in his study on the Kaiserreich gone global, he devotes an interesting chapter on that metaphor of Kulturdünger or Völkerdünger. So what I've now tested this for the Volga German region or the kind of southern Russian region, and have shown exactly the same metaphors. Just one quote from the Odessa Zeitung: "We are proud, quote, to belong to a nation which is one of the first in the world in science and the arts, in trade and industry. We have always had a fertilizing effect on those states which have welcomed us with open arms. I ask you, Russia's Germans, serve faithfully your common fatherland, and that is Russia, even if it has sometimes treated you in rough ways," referring to the kind of post-1870s taken away privileges, etc. But do not allow yourselves to be treated as cultural fertilizer, as Kulturdünger, unquote. There we go, whatever that means. Dietmar Neutatz, in his detailed study on Black Sea and Volhynian Germans, shows that ethnic confidence of this kind was expressed indeed openly only after 1905. My own approach broadens this literature to a global level. Local ethnic entrepreneurs tapped into a pool of language and metaphorical imagery which was used on a global scale. This was less pronounced, but nevertheless existed in similar ways in the lower Volga region. The settlements around Saratov were more isolated from Baltic German and metropolitan information flows, not least because of the migration time frame. The bulk of migration to the Volga basin had more or less happened by the end of the 1760s, whereas the Black Sea region received incomers until the 1840s and beyond. The Volga Germans were largely cut off from most of the 19th century intellectual developments leading up to 1871. For most of the 19th century, they had few intellectuals amongst them who would construct a specifically folk German identity or links with Germany. The region experienced none of the celebrations in 1871, which took place in the Black Sea region. It was only after 1905 that the local information vacuum was partially remedied through the emergence of a secular ethnic press. The Saratov Deutsche Zeitung, which was then renamed into Deutsche Volkszeitung, now reported not only in local, but as I showed in the beginning, also trans-regional and global issues. Ethnic leadership was taken on by Adolf Lahne. He was born in a German settlement colony in the Ural Mountains and studied in Berlin, where he came into contact with nationalist circles and the Pan-German League. He then went to Saratov as a teacher and pursued his aim of national rallying from 1906. He founded a printing works, took over the Deutsche Volkszeitung, and established the Saratover Deutscher Verein, which hadn't existed before. This had 180 active members. The Volkszeitung kept evoking that the Deutscher Verein connected comrades of the same tribe, Stammesgenossen, again, one of those terms that could be found around the world. The Deutscher Verein connected these Stammesgenossen and, quote, fans the fire of national awareness and keeps it alive, unquote. The activities of the club were gradually extended, adding an orchestra, a men's choir, a sports group, a reading circle, and a youth section. A women's group organized support for the poor and was a local example of female middle-class philanthropy. The seeds of gymnastics, Turnen, which were a powerful ethnic glue around the world, not least in the United States, were also soon in Saratov. The Turner section of the Deutscher Verein gave a performance of gymnastic exercise, a Schauturnen, in April 1910 in front of a packed audience. The leadership of the Deutscher Verein stressed that all these cultural activities were fighting tools, Kampfesmittel, against the decline of Germanness and for the cultural elevation of the German minority. A Schauturnen in Saratov was not just a fitness exercise. Rather, it was literally performed and interpreted as a display of German unity, discipline, and superiority, harking back to my earlier comments on groupism. Now, it's all nice to look at all these things within a discourse level, but what we then need to do as a next step, did it actually have an impact on migration patterns? This is something that interests us in this context as well. Since Kevin just mentioned I've got 5 minutes, I'll just won't say much about these two migration movements. What I argue here is that discourse did have an impact on migration patterns through two schemes, and one is Baltikumsiedlung, whereby 20,000 colonists resettled from southern Russia to the Baltics. And this was on the back of a lot of the kind of sources I quoted in my paper. This was for the mainly Baltic landowners who wanted to replace a lot of the kind of local non-German speaking minorities in their on their land with German speakers, and sort of exploited the impoverished states of the southern Russian German speakers in order to convince them to move to the Baltikum. And the other one was Rückwanderung. This was a scheme which was pushed by the Alldeutscher Verband and the Verein für das Deutschtum im Auslande in eastern Prussian provinces to replace a lot of the Polish-speaking minorities with German speakers. Again, a sort of almost a press campaign in the local ethnic newspapers, which I mentioned. And a lot of these articles, I traced some of the kind of CVs of those who actually wrote those, and a lot of these pastors and the people I mentioned earlier had actually written those, and then also added warnings against other destinations. So there was a clear competition between destinations. So when we look at Russian, German, America, we have to keep in mind this was just one of many destinations. The German speakers in southern Russia had a choice, and this was not least channeled by these discourses. So, Warnung vor der Auswanderung nach Brasilien, don't go to Brazil. Deutsch Ostafrika, don't go to any of the German colonies. Yeah, it'll be much better in Eastern Prussia. And even Das gelobte Land America, where the author then goes on, well, maybe it isn't that good. They're ruthless agents who take away your money and before you arrive in America. So all these things, but it's in a kind of concentrated fashion. How can we convince those settlers to actually go to East Prussia rather than elsewhere? And all this was then defined as a große nationale Kulturarbeit. Yeah, this is great cultural work for the nation. So I come to a conclusion, and I'm picking up on something which I didn't say at the beginning. Maybe it was for the better, because it refers to the, sorry, I need to camera there. Because it also refers to this conference program, where I found this quite interesting, that you wrote the kind of conference blurb, and you wrote about the isolated settings of the Volga Germans and in southern Russia, etc. So I think what I'd like to show with this, it wasn't that isolated after all, and this is possibly the main argument of my paper. Maybe in the light of these global views, looking at these sources from a global perspective, as a global historian, I don't see much isolation. Those southern Russian settlers were firmly integrated into metropolitan imaginations of a greater German empire, and it reverberated within those communities as well. I'm not making the argument that all the settlers and colonists were taken in by those ideas. A lot of this was elite constructions of a kind of normative constructions, how the diaspora should be configured. But what we need to discuss is the degree to which it trickled into these communities. But I think we have to take those quotes or those sources a little bit more seriously. So in kind of theoretical and methodological terms, and this is hopefully where the paper has been useful for other papers we'll be hearing in the next 2 days, moving away from that methodological nationalism. This is something Glick Schiller writes about as well. We have to move away from just looking within national frameworks at these sources. Let's look at those from a global perspective. And this is where some of the papers, hopefully, which we'll hear in the next 2 days and discuss them, we will have a kind of overarching theoretical framework, which I've hopefully presented. Thank you.